Well, good day, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Calmly Considered here at Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Allan, your host. I am a pastor, retired professor, Bible moth, theologian in exile, and I am a peddler of hope. And I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture here at Faith Seeking Understanding University, a completely made-up institution, but a place where we invite all seekers to come and ponder profound things free of charge. And I am with again in this month for this episode with Michael Cruz, who is the Grand Poobah Chair of Economics and Public Theology here at FSUU. He is also currently the happiest man in America as his Kansas City Chiefs will be playing in the AFC Championship. So, Michael, Patrick Mahomes is 0-3 against the Bengals.
Yes, he is. This is his big chance to redeem himself.
Yeah.
And he's going to have to do it with a leg. So.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. I'm concerned about what happened with that injury. So. Oops. I've lost your audio there. Couldn't hear you on that. Yep. No, I can't hear you.
How about now?
There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
As once again, I reveal my technological savviness here. Okay. So anyway, yeah. So, God, boy, that should be a good game.
It should be. I'm hoping so. I think it could be one of the better ones. I really like Burrow. I think what the Bengals have done. I actually like the Bills too. I've commenting to a Bills friend recently that I just love the Bills. I'm looking forward to the next few years of all of the games that are going to exist between the Chiefs. These games are fun. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, anyway, good for you. And by the way, I just have to say this. The best news of the day in the sports world is pitchers and catchers, less than a month. They
Absolutely.
report. I got my guard shirt. Yep. There we are. I'm ready to go. Now that I'm retired, Carol and I are going to, at some point, it's not going to happen this year, but at some point, we're going to go out to Arizona for some spring training. And
where do the Guardians do theirs? Are they in Surprise?
Somewhere in Arizona.
Okay.
Somewhere
the Royals
in
are down
Phoenix,
Surprise, Arizona.
Somewhere in the Phoenix area. I can't remember right now the name of the little place. Yeah.
Okay.
So
we talked about doing that too. We can make it a joint trip. So
we should do that. So they're out that way too, right? The Royals.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, we should pick a time when to be out there when the Royals and the Guardians play. That would be great.
There you go. Yeah. That's right. That could be fun.
Yeah. So anyway, all right. Well, we got to get into our conversation, which actually today is
sports.
The sport of gambling. Should Christians take the bet? And that's sort of a double meaning. Because while I want us to talk about gambling in general, we begin with a conversation about the rise of sports gambling. And, Michael, you suggested this. And so I read what you passed along, and then I read some other things. And I guess I didn't realize how big it's become. I mean, I know that I see advertisements for it online and in my social media feed. I don't gamble. In fact, I've never even bought a lottery ticket in my life. But when I started to read, I thought, oh my gosh, this has really become all pervasive. So we probably should start with that conversation just to see, just to kind of get a handle on that. So can you give us a little bit of history on how sports gambling, which of course used to be pretty illegal and you could get in major trouble for gambling on games, what has happened that has changed?
I don't know if I can give a complete summary. My understanding in terms of where this has emerged was about 10 or 12 years ago with the internet and people wanting to participate in fantasy sports leagues. There were ways in which you could compete against each other, put money on your fantasy sports teams, and that did not violate the gambling laws that existed. And I think there was a ruling in 2016 that I can't tell you exactly how the Supreme Court ruled, but basically it liberalized the ability to participate in gambling so that the federal government didn't have the the authority to restrict certain types of gambling. And so that really has begun to open up the windows for sports gambling, and the use of internet apps. FanDuel, DraftKings, I think, are the two biggest ones by far that are involved with that. I think MGM also, I see them advertising a lot now. I don't know what their market share is, but they are continually opening up new avenues of gambling. I don't know how much part you want to go into this, but just things like you used to be able to bet on games, then it became over and under, and now they have apps on your phone where you can do in-game betting. Will the next guy, will he get a extra base hit or not? Suddenly this pops up, and you can bet on that using your phone right inside the game. And so then they keep giving you more and more in-game options to be able to bet. They will do things like they have various incentives where if you bet 2 or 3 times and you've lost those bets, they'll say, "Hey, we won't charge you for those bets. You get that money back, but the way you get it back is that it has to stay. You have to gamble it on something else.
Right.
They don't give you the money actually back. So it's the advertising that they give is pretty shady.
Yeah.
My understanding is that I think in 2021, these numbers are ballpark. I think it was about 50 billion dollars of wagers were placed in sports betting. I believe it was $75 billion last year. I think they anticipate that could be $150 billion this year in sports gambling. So it is becoming a very big and growing opportunity. States are legalizing it. I think there's 30 states, something like that have some form of legalized sports gambling. And see what else, I was going to add something else on top of that. And part of the problem is too that these states do not have regulators set up to be able to handle this stuff. So even though there may be laws or there may be self-policing rules that the gambling industry has set up for themselves, there's really nobody watching these things with any vigilance to make sure that these companies are behaving.
Yeah.
So
it's real. So I was reading a little bit about the idea of gambling like during the game. Like, for example, I suppose, you could put out there, it's next week is Patrick Mahomes. Will he drive on this drive him down for a touchdown, right? And then you can bet on that kind of stuff. It's interesting. What I thought of, by the way, was a couple of the seats where I sit, where when I go to the Guardians game, really good seats behind her third base, but there is somebody behind me who obviously it's a season ticket package, but every now and then there's a couple of 3 guys that sit there, and that's what they do. I mean, they got like cash they're passing around back there behind me. So they'll say, the one guy will say, $10 that, so and so strikes out.
Yeah.
And I'm just, of course, my first thought is okay, all right, I don't have that kind of money to lose. But it's I mean, I have to confess, probably should say this right out the back, that gambling's never been a temptation of mine, right?
No,
I mean, I find the conventional ways of losing my money by having to fix the house and fix the car sufficient, right?
Right. Exactly.
I don't need more ways to do it. But you talked about the regulators. Well, as I recall, by the way, that Supreme Court's decision you mentioned, that basically the argument was it's not the federal government's job to tell this. It's up to the states to make their own decisions, which is a typical federalist position, which I don't necessarily think is a bad one. But the law in anything always takes a while to catch up to the reality. Isn't that the case?
Yes, it does. And in this particular case, you have the gambling industry. There's no, to my knowledge, there's no restriction on the amount of money that they can give to legislators and to political causes in order to advance the agenda that they want to advance. The state benefits often from these because of taxes that the gambling brings in, as well as, in many cases, in some forms of gambling, It actually helps fund part of their state budget. They get some of their money from the gambling enterprises.
Yeah.
And so you have legislators that have an incentive to have a very robust, active gambling environment in their state. And so then the question becomes, so who's regulating this? Who's looking out for the interests of people that could be harmed by the gambling industry? So, yeah.
Yeah. It is of concern to me. I have to confess, there's two ways I always look at issues, Michael, as a Christian. The first is, how do I look at it as a Christian? And that's a question we want to try and answer, as far as how do I bring my Christian convictions to any issue. The second question is more of a larger question of does this help or hurt the common good? Because I
Right.
mean, not I'm a Christian, so I can't put my Christian convictions on hold for the sake of the larger population. People who say Christians need to leave their convictions out of the voting booth. Well, we can't do that. I can't leave my convictions as a Christian outside the voting booth any more than an atheist can leave his or her
Right.
convictions that God doesn't exist outside the voting booth. So that's just a ridiculous
Yeah.
expectation. However, having said that, I recognize, as one who has an interest in the common good, that I live in a world, you and I live in a society where not everybody's a Christian. So how do we
Right.
navigate through that, right, in the conversation?
Right.
So those are the two prongs that I think about this. You know, how do I think the Christian should look at this, in the church, and then what about the common good? So let's kind of have at that with the general thing of gambling. Gambling's been around, as we know, probably since the dawn of time, and every time I
And
think of, go
if I
ahead,
could
go
just
ahead, please.
if I could just jump in there for a second too, I think one of the things in terms of American history that is important to remember is that in the colonial days, we did not have there was no colonial banking system. There was nobody from whom you could borrow money in order to build a building or start an enterprise. Lotteries were very typical. That's how Harvard, Yale, many of the early Christian institutions were developed, was through lotteries. The financing for the Jamestown adventure to go to Jamestown and found that colony was done by a lottery, actually in England, raising money. And so you had lotteries that were done, particularly after the 1600s. The Puritans tend to be very opposed to gambling, but by the 1700s, when you're needing to raise money, and that continued on into the early 1800s,
Yeah.
and it was big. It was then that there was a move to try to restrict gambling. I'm not going to go into all the details of the history of this, but by 1840, gambling was largely outlawed. And then a second wave began after the Civil War, particularly in the South, but many other regions that have been devastated, where you had no financial institutions. Again, lotteries, gambling operations, that type of thing, in order to raise money to be able to rebuild their societies. And then that progressed. You have saloons, you have, it just expanded everywhere. And people began to see gambling, alcohol, brothels, that type of thing were the bane of society. And so the prohibitionist movement, came into existence and basically restricted all those. And so by, a little after 1900, you basically have outlawed all those things as well. And then once again, a third wave begins after the Depression, where you have, I can't remember which state it was that began allowing certain types of gambling. I think it's New Hampshire. In the 1950s, they began pari-mutuel betting, where you can bet on horses and dogs. And then in 1964, I think New Hampshire begins the state lottery. And by the time you get to the 1970s into the 1980s, you're starting to have casinos and places like Atlantic City and all these other places begin to develop around the country. And this sports gambling development is just now sort of that trajectory on steroids because of the internet and what's happening there. The likelihood, it seems to me, is that the difficulties that developed because gambling was so available and was so pervasive, that the problems that caused are lost to us in this generation because we weren't alive to see what happened previous times. My guess is this is going to have to go awry again in order to get a swing back that pulls it back to something that's more reasonable. So
Yeah,
yeah,
those are good points. Thank you for that history. To me, theologically, I think what a profile in human nature that we can't get people to give $50 to build a library, but we'll get them to give $100 if we promise them $10,000 as possibility of winning, right? I mean, you
right,
really, really what gambling does. Let me just say it this way.
right,
I think gambling appeals to our baser human nature,
okay,
right?
yeah.
Um,
How
you
so?
know,
Maybe
yeah,
say
people won't vote for a tax levy to fund a school, but they'll play the lotto, which helps to
right,
fund the school if they have a chance of winning $200 million. It's kind of an interesting
right.
profile in
Yep.
sin, isn't it? So
Yes, it is. Yeah.
let's talk about this for a minute, Michael. So before we I kind of have a hunch we're probably on fairly on the same page on gambling, but let's say,
Okay.
what is there are there any benefits that gambling coming to a community, I 20 years ago I thought Ohio would never approve casino gambling. But now we do.
Yeah.
We have it in Columbus, we have
Right.
it in Cleveland. And the argument was by officials, well, all this money's going to West Virginia, right? And we got to
Right.
keep the money in Ohio, so let's have it. So we have it now. So is there any benefit to this kind of enterprise?
Well, I think economically, I think you can make the case that there are benefits that do come from gambling. I mean, I think they gambling industry advertises those. It creates
Yeah.
jobs. So you have a business that has new jobs. It can raise money for schools or for the government coffers. I mean, it can make contributions along those lines. So there are benefits, but the question is, what are the what on the other side of the ledger, what are the costs
Yeah.
of having those? And I remember studies years ago, I haven't seen anything recently, but that said that for every dollar of what do I want to say, of advantages that gambling brings, it brings $3 of disadvantages in terms of social problems that it creates, the debt that it creates, the addictions, and then the resulting problems that come from addictions and debt, that type of thing. So yes, there are benefits to it. I don't think anybody can deny that. But what is it relative to the cost that we know happens when gambling becomes pervasive? I think that's the challenge.
Yeah.
And I'll. But
Go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
was just going to mention, yeah, the video that we were watching that I sent to you, I thought was very interesting. They showed one chart on Australia, which is far ahead of the United States in terms of its gambling legalization. They showed one community on the graph, I think it was in Melbourne area, where it was a fairly wealthy community, and they're talking about the average gambling losses. I think it was gambling losses for that community was $180 per person
Mm.
in that community. And then it shifted over to another community just a short distance away that was a low income community. And the average losses per person were $1,558. And so the issue is that people who have money often gamble as an aside. It's something kind of fun and novel to do occasionally. It's a source of enjoyment. But for many people who are poor and don't have hopes of getting an income, this becomes a desperate attempt at trying to get rich. And the poorer and more desperate they are, the more difficult that situation is. And then it's just siphoning even more money away from their coffers that could actually help them improve their lives.
Yeah.
So it ends up becoming this very regressive tax on people and society.
Yeah. Well, for a lot of people in that boat, it becomes sort of like your chance at a nice retirement fund. And
Right. Yeah.
so I mean, we could now, Michael, we could take a libertarian approach to this, and we could say, well, look, this is not our fault. If someone, it's the same thing with alcohol, right? And say, look, if someone there are plenty of people who drink and drink responsibly, and there are other people. It's not my fault if so and so can't handle his or her liquor. Can't we say the same thing about gambling? Look, I go to the casino once a year, and I, uh, lose 100, $200 bucks that I can afford. It's not my fault if somebody takes themselves into massive debt because they
Sure.
can't control it. We could take a libertarian approach to this. What do you think?
Well, I think there's an element to that. I don't think that prohibition. I think we saw that in the United States. That attempting to totally prohibit something leads to its own set of social ills, and that's what we saw with prohibition in the 1920s and 30s. So I don't think outright prohibition, but I think putting guardrails around behavior that is potentially destructive, particularly when you think of things like alcohol, gambling, prostitution, those types of things. Those are things which you could legitimately say that people can make an informed choice to be involved in those things that don't necessarily harm other people. But when you look at it on a mass scale and what happens, there are too many human frailties involved to simply just leave it as a wide open, unregulated activity. And I think it was interesting in the talking about the Australia experience versus the United States, that in Australia, well, like you said, in the United States, most casinos tend to be located outside of major cities. You have to travel a distance to get to a casino and gamble there. So it becomes an event that you have to go to, and then you leave there and you're away from it. In Australia, those casinos are right in the heart of the city. And in many of the cities, it's sort of the major attraction that's put there at the city. So it's very easy to get to have access to the gambling. And that's I think the challenge that we're going to see with sports betting is that it isn't so incredibly accessible. One of the ways that cultures have used to limit gambling addiction and the problems that exist from gambling is by restricting its accessibility, making it not illegal, but how accessible it is.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we're going to do that with sports gambling. It's a whole new world. But I think that's so. So I would say, I think even libertarians, except for the truly hardcore ones that are thoroughly ideological, I think even libertarians would agree that there are sometimes cases where regulation is necessary in order to create a more better functioning society.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I'm with you on this. I mean, we know what prohibition didn't do what it was supposed to do. So why would we think outlawing gambling would fix it? Because it wouldn't. But there does need to be guardrails and restrictions put up, and I'm hoping that at some point that will happen. So let's go back real quick, because you had talked about that our generation really hasn't felt the negatives of what gambling has done because it's been outlawed. What are the negatives? So we can say, okay, casinos, gambling, lotteries can stimulate the economy. By the way, you and I both know that if gambling on the side of those who own casinos and other gambling enterprises, if it wasn't lucrative, they wouldn't do it. So there's a part of me that wants to say.
Absolutely.
There's part of me that wants to say, why are you going to do something you're going to lose the money? But that's just me. I don't quite understand it. What are the negative things that we have seen in history that have resulted from gambling in which there are no, as you said, guardrails?
Right. I think there are at least three different ways gambling ends up having a negative impact on society and culture. The first one was the one I was just talking about a second ago, is that it ends up becoming a regressive tax. Mm-hmm. People that have money tend not to gamble in great amounts, and so they don't end up having debt issues. It's people that are poor that often end up being the greatest victims of gambling because of their circumstances. It's false hope is what it is. It's an organized effort to distribute false hope to people, profit off of it. That I think is on the regressive side of it. The second one is addiction. That I think it's a small percentage, maybe 2% or so of the population has a propensity towards addiction to gambling at a serious level, and probably more at a less serious level, but still it's taking money away from other activities and things that would be more predictive and more beneficial to the individual and to society than gambling would. And then I think the third thing is probably corruption. corruption often ends up becoming a part of this. The politicians and the people who are involved in the gambling interest so often end up in partnership with each other, and that corruption then ends up corrupting other aspects of society, law and order, and morals, and that type of thing. And so I think those are the things that we've typically seen in the past. And so, for instance, one of the things I think would be a good idea is that I think gambling industry should be prohibited from being able to make financial contributions to campaigns and to candidates. They shouldn't be able to give money to those entities. I think that's one place to help deal with the corruption. And if we're going to have it legal, we need to have robust systems at the front end, helping particularly teenagers and people that are going to be most susceptible to this because they haven't had experience. The downside of gambling, just like we have on smoking warnings, you buy a pack of cigarettes and it says these cigarettes will kill you. Same thing with some of the gambling stuff. I think there needs to be warnings there at the front end, and at the back end, there needs to be a robust system for helping people that have become addicted to gambling, and systems that are set up to deal with that. So anyway, I think that those are the three downsides. It's aggressive, it's addictive, and it often leads to corruption. And so you have to have guardrails that help address those.
Well, the whole money in politics, Michael, has just been a recipe for disaster in the last decade, right? I mean, I don't, I know that there's been a lot of criticism of the Supreme Court overturning or rejecting McCain-Feingold and all of that. I'm not enough of a constitutional expert to know whether whether that was a good ruling or not. But what I do know is that it just seems to me in the last decade, money has just wreaked havoc in our campaign system, right?
Right.
And I mean, and that's connected to this whole thing with gambling. Yeah. So
right.
So we got more than one issue at stake here in dealing with this.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious from your standpoint, thinking of this theologically. Assume that we didn't have these specific issues, regardless of whether it's aggressive, addictive, or can lead to corruption. From just sort of a spiritual formation standpoint, in terms of our personal Christian walk, how do you see gambling and its impact on who I am as a Christian, and how that's likely to form me in ways that are not helpful?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty strict on this as a Christian. I think it's a stewardship issue. I think one of the key, well, for example, I just don't think Christians should gamble. I just don't think we should.
Right.
Now, I also don't want to be a legalist. If a Christian buys a lottery ticket, I'm not going to berate them. I mean, there are worse things they could do. But I think it's a stewardship issue. We believe the Bible, I mean, I think is very clear that everything that we have comes from God. Now, we can talk about whether certain things we have are through exploitation and maybe not then directly given by God, the complication of what it means to be blessed. But the reality is all that we enjoy, all that we have is given to us from God. And so, in our system, the way we usually look at this is, for a lot of Christians look at it this way, that if I give my 10% to the church, and most Christians don't tithe, but if I give my 10% to the church, then I can do with whatever I want with the other 90%. That's really not biblical. I may tithe to the church, and I do that. We do tithe. That doesn't mean I can do with whatever I want with the 90%. That means that I'm still a steward of that I am to spend that wisely, and that I am to think about how I use my money. And so from my perspective, I have a hard time justifying the willingness to lose money or the willingness to lose money in order to gain money. Now, so that really is, so I'm having a real hard time from a Christian perspective, giving the thumbs up to casinos and lotteries. But I mean, I think one of the comments that I have gotten at times in response is, well, people play the stock market. We invest
Yeah.
To which I say as well, that can be risky too. That can be, if you put your money in junk bonds,
Right.
but I see that probably get your thought on this. I see that as less of a issue of gambling and more of kind of a, that I give the bank my money and they invest my money, and in response they guarantee me whatever. Or, I invest
Right.
in a company that is not necessarily completely without risk, but but
Right.
there's not this level of, I don't know what I want to say, chance. There's not this, I mean, it's almost, it's if in doing it you're hoping to produce a good out of that. So I tend
There
to
you go.
see that differently. uh Although I would say again, a Christian probably ought to think twice about putting their money into some get rich. I don't know if Bitcoin applies here or not. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
so
Right.
I just struggle. I just struggle for giving a Christian. I just struggle with giving any kind of Christian justification for gambling. It's hard for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the points that you're making there, I think, is that if I look at an activity, and you could look at gambling and say me participating in some gambling transaction, that doesn't harm anyone. No one's harmed by doing that.
Yeah.
But is that the only criteria that we use for what we're doing as Christians? Does it do anything positive? Does it help anything? Does it create anything good? Does it help anyone? And I think when you're talking about investing, we I on rare occasions have bought stock in an individual company and held that stock to see what happens. I always invest broadly across the market,
Yeah.
for to get the market returns, because what we've seen for multiple centuries now is that over time the valuation tends to go up, and if you are invested in that broadly, your investments will go up. Maybe not as much as you want, who knows, but it tends not to go up. Gambling, you are guaranteed almost to a fault that you will lose. There is no positive thing, and there's only the people who are running the game are the only ones who win.
Yeah.
So it's not, um, you're not really doing anything productive or helpful by gambling. You
Right.
may not be harming anyone, but you're also not doing anything helpful either. Yeah, some people can make, well, it can be a form of enjoyment, and I get that. I've been involved, I think, in past years where we've done March Madness and get a pool of people together, and you say, okay, everybody put in a buck, and you know
Mhm.
whoever gets the best Final Four or whatever, ends up getting the pot. And I think I've done that once or twice over the course of my life. I like you, gambling just doesn't hold an interest in me. It
Yeah.
doesn't doesn't do it for me. So, but there are, and I think the informal activities and doing things like that. But when you're talking about supporting an entire industry that is largely unregulated, and and one piece I didn't bring up this too. I just want to bring this in. I talked about the politicians and the gambling companies, but let's also talk about the sports entities, the NHL, the NBA, MLB, NFL. They benefit by all of this as well too. They have a vested interest in making this work, because if people are gambling on the players and on the outcomes of games and so on, that means they're going to spend put more eyes and spend more of their time watching the games that these various sports entities put out.
Yeah.
And so they are going to benefit as well from viewership of people paying attention to
Yeah.
their sports as well. So it's actually sort of a three-way mutually reinforcing opportunity for corruption. But
Yeah.
anyway, I kind of went on a side there, but yeah, well, I'll just leave it there.
Well, who was just recently the coach who came out who had to say that he got threatened because people who had bet a lot of money on a game or something that they had lost, that he got actually messages.
Yeah, then you
This
start
is,
getting into that
well, yeah, you
avenue.
start
Yeah,
getting into people who put way too much money on a game and they lose it, and then they blame the player or they blame the coach. Now I recognize that those are the extremes and
right,
probably the minority, but they're there. And
right.
so how does the law catch up to say, we're not going to tolerate any kind of threats like that, and if you make them, you are liable to prosecution. That's where
Right.
the law has to really catch up. The other issue is, remember the good old days when, like Pete Rose, if you gambled on the game as a player,
Yeah.
the good old days. I mean, and so again, what other recipe now do we have for corruption with players getting involved in this? It's become big. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it should be of great concern.
Well, particularly when you're talking about all it takes is having an app on your phone and
Yeah,
doing it. Who's monitoring your app? Are they wiretapping your app to make sure you're not betting on games? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
but it's that accessible, that easy. Yeah,
Well,
I think there's all sorts of
in preparation for our conversation today, I got into some of these, on my news feed I'd have for FanDuel or whatever. I'd click into it just to
right.
kind of get the lay of the land on everything, and all of a sudden, I'm getting I'm getting advertisements all over the place for this, which is a waste
Yeah,
of time. They're
right,
wasting their time for me, but it was just
right.
interesting that well, I've said for a long time, Michael, that people who are concerned, still concerned about the right to privacy. If you're on social media and have a smartphone, forget it. You lost that a long
Right.
time
Yeah.
ago. But that doesn't mean
Right.
there shouldn't be some safeguards and precautions, right?
Right. Right. I agree.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think that that's the answer. I'm not in this personally. I'm not in favor. Although I will almost never. I can't imagine myself ever using any of these gambling opportunities. I'm not in favor of making them absolutely illegal. I don't think
yeah,
prohibition for these things is the answer, but I do think there has to be tight regulation and safeguards put in place that help keep this stuff in check, and that does not exist at this
yeah,
point.
yeah.
So I think the question then,
I like your image of the guardrails, and I think in a free society where you've got different people with different convictions and different views, I think we do need to be very careful about the kinds of regulations that shut down as opposed to putting up the guardrails. To say,
right,
we allow freedom, we understand freedom, and I understand as a person who believes in a free society and who wants to be free, I do need to understand that that's a trade-off, that some people might use that freedom in ways I wouldn't do that, right? I'm not
right,
going to take $10 and gamble it, but I accept the fact that my neighbor might, and that's okay.
right,
But what we need to do is to say we recognize that human nature being what it is, that we can get off on the wrong path pretty quickly if we're not careful. So as a society, we're not going to enforce certain behaviors or prohibit certain behaviors, but we're going to put
right,
some parameters on it because, by the way, because we care about you, right? We care about
right,
you. You
right,
can't drive drunk. You can get drunk, right? You can sit in your home
right,
and drink to your heart's content. But we're saying you can't drive drunk because first of all, we do care for you and we don't want you to get
right.
hurt, but we care for other people and we don't want them to get hurt either.
Exactly.
It's the same way here. Okay, if you
Right.
want to gamble, fair enough.
Sure.
We're not, but we're going to put up some railings here because for your sake and for the
Right.
sake of people around you.
Exactly.
One of the
I,
things, Michael, John Wesley in England, um, one of the things that he saw in London was the the prevalence of hard liquor and the husbands who were the breadwinners going out to the tavern and basically drinking away their paychecks. And
right.
and for Wesley, and Wesley was not a teetotaler. He did not want his
Hmm.
preachers drinking hard liquor, but he even in his journal somewhere talks about drinking a draft or two of beer uh,
Right.
because he had a cold. So I think he needed to sleep or
Right.
something. But he he understood that certain kinds of behavior can radiate out and can
Right.
really affect people. So he saw the damage that alcohol abuse by, in that day, of course, the 18th century, the husbands and the breadwinners had on the families. So
Right.
he endeavored to say to his Methodist people, all right, I don't want you drinking hard liquor because look at the situation. But
Right.
he also moved to be in ministry to those families. I mean, I see the same thing here.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
there are behaviors that radiate out that affect other people.
Right. And it I was actually reflecting on this a day or two ago. I was thinking it's in relation to this topic, but it applies to a lot of things. I think you have society at a point where gambling is rampant. Society is corrupt. There's all sorts of social evils around, and so you have a movement that rises up that tries to curtail that, to bring that back down. And so you have many times it's Christian activists who have been at the leader of some of those movements to do that. And so there's a very clear vision as to what they're trying to accomplish and why they are abstaining from those activities. And so then they raise their children with those values as well, and their children hear the stories that their parents tell them about the evils that existed and why they're doing it. So the second generation, but it's now becoming secondhand to that generation. Then a third generation comes along who grows up with the prohibitions against this, but has not real knowledge of what the impetus was for the prohibitions in the first place. But this is just the way we've always done it, and this is what Christians do. This is how we behave. And then a fourth generation comes along and says, "Wait a minute, why are we doing? Why are we doing what we're all this stuff again? Well, I don't get why we can't gamble or we can't do this, that, and the other thing." And so then there becomes this movement away from that restricted thing for which they see no real basis for it, that then starts the snowball rolling in another direction where the difficulties begin to develop again, which gives impetus to a new activist generation that seeks to restrain it. It just feels like with these sort of vice issues, there seems to be a cyclical approach to that through at least looking through American history as I look at that. So I don't know if I'm over sociology, using my sociology too much there, but it does seem to me that there is an ebb and a flow to our awareness of the challenges of some of these issues.
I mean, I agree with that completely. And I mean, human beings, we are forgetful. Forgetful,
Yeah.
I mean, as far as long-term memory, meaning we don't pass these things along. I mean, if you go and you read the Old Testament, if you decide you're going to read, like 3 chapters a day to get through the Old Testament, so you get the overview, you don't really study it. But if you start and you read the overview, I mean, it is second verse, same as the first. I mean,
Yeah,
God's
it is
people, I
over and
mean, it is completely repetitive. Human behavior is so predictable. Um, and you see this in the story of the judges, right? Everyone does what is right in their own eyes. The people are oppressed. They cry out to God. God raises up a judge. The land has rest. And then several years later, everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes again. I mean, this is just
yeah,
predictable. We are still, I mean, boy, we could have this conversation over all kinds of issues where we
right,
continue centuries later to still make the same mistake. And I'm not just talking unbelievers here. We like to point the finger. I'm talking
right.
Christians.
No,
We
Christians, yes, right,
we continue to forget and make the same mistakes. And
right,
no, people say history repeats itself. I don't think it repeats itself. Was it Mark Twain who said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes"? Was that Mark Twain who
right.
said that?
That,
I
it's
think that's right.
attributed to him. I don't know. Yeah,
I think that's right.
yeah,
History
yeah,
doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so,
right,
Einstein's definition of insanity. So
right,
anyway,
right.
so
Yeah, yeah,
what else do we want to say about this, Michael? I mean, for me, again, I just want to point out as a Christian that for me, this is a stewardship issue. I think in a society
right,
like ours, in a society like America, we're prosperous. A lot of us, not all of us, obviously, but we don't think about where our next meal's coming from. Uh,
right.
when you have, well, how do I say this? When you have money to burn, you
Yeah,
burn it. And
right. Yeah,
and it really is a stewardship issue. And I think of my friends that I have been in ministry with in Cuba and Zimbabwe and other places where they would, I mean, they actually would okay to have the kind of money to just blow it like that, but they don't. And so for me
Right.
too, as a Christian who should have a global perspective, I also need to think
Right.
about how my life's choices as a Christian, how that also looks in other places.
Right. Yeah, and I'll go back to a statement that you were talking about earlier. I think it was Tony Campolo who always used to say, "You give 10% of your money to God as a tithe." He says, "That's great. Now, what are you going to do with the other 90% of God's money?"
Exactly right.
And I think that's that in a is great stewardship in a nutshell. That doesn't mean everything that you spend with the 90% can't be stuff that's somewhat frivolous or just for enjoyment and for recreation. That's part of being human being. But being wise and judicious about how we spend that 90%, I think is really what it comes down to.
Right.
And if for every dollar I'm spending on gambling, I'm creating $3 of social ills, is that the best use of using God's money?
Exactly
And
right.
that's, I
No,
think,
yeah.
where yeah,
Yeah, I want to be careful here. We don't give the impression that, you can't buy a candy bar for a buck.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly right.
and I'm
Yeah,
not suggesting that at all. Sometimes mental
right,
health requires chocolate, but I we just need to think about that after I have given what I should give to God, uh, doesn't mean that the rest of the stuff is uh, fair game for anything
right,
that I want to spend it on. I do need to think about
exactly,
the implications of what it means to be a steward. Yeah. Okay.
right, right.
Wow. Well, Michael, anything else we want to say on this?
I think that's it. I think this is going to be an interesting topic to watch in the coming years.
Yeah.
I'm afraid it's going to get much more ugly and much worse before it gets better. But I think it's
Yeah.
something for
Well,
Christians
we
to be.
human beings tend to do that. We wait until, it's just like the issue with Social Security and Medicare. We all know that these are on unsustainable trajectories, but until the generation that really gets hurt by it has to deal with it, nothing will change, right?
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
and the people who will suffer the most will be the ones who will have to fix it, because
Right.
right now we're not going to do it, and politicians aren't going to do it. The voters aren't going to let it happen, and I'm not suggesting how you fix that. I'm just saying that we know it. We know that it's not sustainable, and at some point something's going to have to happen. But we tend to wait, you know,
Yeah.
um, until the last possible minute. That's human nature. So anyway, I don't know what to do
Sure.
about that.
Right.
But anyway, all right. Well, Michael, thank you for your insight as always. And
Thank you.
friends, we are glad that you joined us today. This is Faith Seeking Understanding. I'm Allan Bevere, and reminding you that the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who said, "I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand." Friends, keep seeking. Have a good day.